So it's now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dianne Saxe to give today's plenary. Dianne's the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, the role she's held since 2015. And for those of you who are not from Ontario, this agency or her group acts as a watchdog over Ontario's environmental, energy and climate performance and acts as a guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. So Dianne has 40 years of experience as an environmental lawyer. She first started working in the Ontario Public Service and then on two major Bay Street law firms before she started her own boutique environmental law firm. She has a doctorate in environmental law from Osgoode Hall, and she's won numerous and prestigious law awards. I'm very excited to hear her talk because a lot of what we do here today, we're talking about the science, but unless the science can get into policy and the policy can be safely enacted and there's watchdogs to make it happen, a lot of the good work we're trying to do wouldn't actually happen. So this talk, we'll try and get it onto the IAGLR website in the next day or so, and afterwards there's some brochures her team has brought along to share with you. But right now I'd just like to welcome Dianne to a great talk.
Okay, hello. Actually, the mic's over there. What do you want me to do about that? Will it reach? Folks at the back, can you hear me? Yes, no, yes? Is this good? All right. Look at that, it works. All right, well, thanks very much for inviting me here today. It's a great privilege to be here with you all. I took a look through the program, and I have no idea what bioturbating is, but I'm very impressed by all the research that you folks do, and frankly, all the work we do stands on the shoulders of folks like you. It's a big part of my job to translate science for policymakers and try to bring the right fact to the right people at the right moment. And for that, we need to know what it is. And so we rely on you folks. As Matthew mentioned, the slides will be available. I've got too many slides, so I'm going to try to go through them as quickly as I can. So the environmental bill, how many people here are from Ontario? Okay, great. So hopefully you know that we have an Environmental Bill of Rights in Ontario. It's one of the only places in the world that we do. And it's based on two key insights. First of all, that environment is too important to be left just to government. How many people agree? Yes. And that within government, it can't be left only to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which is a small ministry with no central powers. So if you can't leave it entirely to the government, well, who can we look to? The idea was that if we give the public rights to participate in these decisions, perhaps they'll be better. So my job is, first of all, to be the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and I am also a watchdog. I report to the Speaker of the Legislature and through him to the members of the Provincial Parliament and to them, through them, to all Ontarians on three quiet, slow-moving little topics: energy, environment, and climate. Also, of course, not politically sensitive. What we hope are really good, nonpartisan, reliable reports. We have summaries of some of them there on the table. They are all available on our website in both official languages. We also have a webinar for every report that you're welcome to look at. That's where you find them on our site. If you could use hard copies for events or schools, let us know. And another service that we provide is this. A key piece of the Environmental Bill of Rights is that the government is obliged to notify the public when they're proposing a significant environmental decision, and to give the public an opportunity to comment. This is a very important right. Those comments do actually make a difference. The government is required by law to take them into account, but that only works if people find out on time that the notices have been published. And the website is not very good. So if you want to know, if you are interested in, I don't know, turtles, Blanding's turtles, for example, and you wanted to know when a significant decision was being considered on that, you can go to our website where it says get registry notices that interest you, and if you put in your email address and the keyword that you want, you will get an email for free to your email box as soon as a notice is posted. How many of you can use that tool? Okay, please do. All right, so I was asked to talk about algae, and you folks here know far more about algae than I do, but you're you're all aware, it's one of many stresses affecting the Great Lakes, but it's a good example of the kind of policy failures that we are grappling with all the time. And it's Helen mentioned working for 40 years. I'm in the 40-plus years club myself, and it's just amazing, 56 years later, how few of the lessons of Silent Spring we have learned. We continue to treat the natural world as if it was a garbage can. And the consequences are here. So algae, in a way, is a poster child for all four of my mandates: the public participation piece, as well as the energy piece, the climate piece, and environmental protection. And so I've been commissioner for 2.5 years. We've reported on a number of these, and so I'm just going to run through a few of the things we've talked about. You've all seen this photo before, I hope. Yes, everybody's seen this photo before, Lake 226? My take is that the science on this is basically pretty clear. There's lots of details. I know there's lots of details, but we know the basics. We know that the toxyl algal blooms are growing. We can see that in the numbers. Hell, you can see it from space. We know it's not just Lake Erie. I mean, Lake Erie is the one we tend to think about, but it's already in a number of the other Great Lakes. It's in some inland lakes. We got a request under the Environmental Bill of Rights about Muskrat Lake, and then I was really astonished. I'm about to take my 3-year-old grandson for his very first canoe trip, and of course it's going to rain the whole time we're out there, but anyway, that's another story. But Algonquin Park, right? How many people here have canoed in Algonquin Park? Okay? We love this place. It is where we go to get away from all the rest of it. And last year there were 3 lakes in Algonquin where the algae made it too dangerous to swim, to drink, to fish. Even if you boiled the water, it was too dangerous. The constructions were, you can paddle through, but don't stop. It's astonishing. And why? Well, I mean, the basic answer you guys figured out. It's phosphorus. Where does phosphorus come from? It comes from human and animal waste, and it comes from fertilizers. And we let it run into the water, we get algae. So, there's lots of environmental problems that I deal with where we do not know the science. We don't know what the mechanism is. We don't know what to do about it. This one is comparatively simple. It's one key nutrient. It's a precious, irreplaceable, globally limited nutrient that we ought to be treating with great care, because when it runs out, what are we going to do to grow food? It's valuable, and we still let it just run into the lakes. So this is craziness. And it's particularly aggravating because we thought we fixed it. So when I was a young lawyer in the Ministry of Environment, this was one of the great successes. Look at that, we did this great thing. Scientists figured out it was phosphorus. We looked around, where's the phosphorus coming from? Well, there was a hell of a lot of it in detergent that didn't need to be there, and there was a lot coming out from sewage treatment plants, and so $1 gazillion were spent improving sewage treatment plants. And most of the phosphorus was taken out of the detergents, and presto bingo, the lake got better. And we all patted ourselves on the back and thought how smart we were. It didn't happen by accident. It happened by good science and then coordinated governance, good policy work all around the lakes, because the lakes are affected no matter which direction stuff comes from. But it came under control. And now here we are, and it's back, and it's worse than ever. So the main sources now are much tougher to deal with. You can see that the color coding in this slide didn't get fixed, but Lake Erie, you can see only about 12% of the phosphorus, as best we can tell, is coming from point sources now. That's basically sewage treatment plants, the kind of things that governments are used to squeezing down, and the way we got it solved in the 70s. Will that fix it now? I mean, clearly not. We've got better data for Lake Simcoe, and you can see in Lake Simcoe there's about 7% coming from the wastewater treatment plants, which are already at least tertiary. There's about 6% coming from septic tanks all around the lake, which some of them are in pretty bad shape. There is a little bit coming from the Holland Marsh and the concentrated farming area, but I mean, look at the rest of it. Huge amount coming through aerial deposition, which I haven't seen a scientific paper for, but have to assume it's mostly agricultural soil blowing around with phosphorus on it. And maybe that's what's causing the problem in Algonquin Park, although no one's told me that. and then so much of it in the watershed. These are much harder to deal with than just ordering a sewage treatment plant to fix. And what's ahead is going to make it so much tougher. We've got lots more people coming. We've got climate change exacerbating both temperature and the intensity of storms. We've got a lot of things changing in agriculture. We're up to a third of all agricultural land in Ontario is now farmed by tenants. So they don't have the same incentive that an owner has to preserve their soil for the long run. It's more of a mining thing for them. They've got no security of tenure. In many cases, there's no contract. We've got intense pressure. Corn prices are really high, so all kinds of marginal land, woodrows, hedgerows, all kinds of things are being turned into corn because you can make a lot of money with corn these days. Losing the buffers. We've got a lot more fertilizer being put on in the fall, which then gets washed into the watercourses during the non-growing season, so that doesn't do anybody any good. We're losing wetlands, we're losing woodlands, we've got lots more golf courses, we've got governments with other priorities, and those of you from Ontario know we just had an election. And you know as much as I know about the priorities of the new government. So we've got lots of people already. I mean, even 10 years ago, it was pretty clear that a significant part of the Great Lakes Basin was seriously damaged just by municipal wastewater effluents. Some of that may be better now. There has been a lot of money on wastewater treatment, but on the other hand, we keep adding a lot more people, and we're planning to add another 50% of the population of the Greater Golden Horseshoe in the next 25 years. And that's what we're planning. If you think about all the millions of people on the move around the world, it may be more than that. Where are we going to put all these people in? I assure you all of them are going to go to the toilet. And climate change is accelerating. I mean, we know that the temperature is rising. We know that a very large amount of the extra heat that's being trapped is going into watercourses. And we know warmer watercourses grow more algae and grow it faster. So, and there's no clear plan forward. We have less cooperation in some ways among governments. We've got governments pulling in different directions. We've got more, less of a common sense of duty, less of a common sense that we all belong to the lakes, as Helen described. And we've got a whole series of really complex problems. So scientists, basically, I think you guys are doing your job. Yes, there's always more to do. I bet you all think you could use more funding and more time and more equipment and more staff, and I'm sure all of that is true. But basically, you guys seem to be doing the right things. You recognize phosphorus. You've been tracking the improvements. You've been identifying, where the key points are and what can be done about it. Recognizing the nearshore shunt. You've been drawing attention to issues, and there's lots to learn, but who's paying attention? It's really hard to get public attention. I mean, after all, they could listen to Stormy Daniels instead. And the election we just had, environmental issues were almost invisible, which is pretty hard to deal with, given that, I spent a lot of my life going around Ontario and other places telling everyone that climate change is the most important issue on all of our plates. It is changing everything we care about. It is going to change everything we care about even more. It's coming faster than anyone thought possible. And Mother Nature always wins. I heard yesterday that the windstorm we had on May the 4th caused something like $450 million in damages just that day. But anyway, so now what? You've shown us the problem is phosphorus. We know where it's coming from. We know quite a bit about what to do about it. We know why it matters, but not a lot is being done about it. So there's lots of regulatory failures, and I picked out a few of them that we have written about that I thought I'd just point out. So first one is stormwater. I mean, we keep pretending that stormwater is a public problem that can be managed on public land at public expense. And this cannot be right. The United Kingdom realized this really in the wake of the devastating floods of 2007. It was the largest destruction of civil infrastructure that they've had since the Luftwaffe. They have had to come to grips with the fact that this can no longer be a public problem, but we haven't. We are still allowing property owners to just shunt the water off their land as fast as possible, generally paying nothing or close to nothing for it, and expecting the public at public expense to fix it all. And if it doesn't work and somebody gets flooded, they think the public purse should pay for whatever their losses are. And if they didn't buy insurance, they still think the public should pay for it. And this is a very powerful public belief. So how well prepared are municipalities for this? And the answer is abominably. Last time we did an evaluation, we had about $6.8 billion in deficit funding for infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure that municipalities had already identified they needed for what was already happening, not what's coming, with increased intensification, more pavement. I mean, every time we drive up and down the roads, there's another subdivision being built, another area being paved. So more runoff, faster runoff, warmer runoff, more polluted runoff, as far as the eye can see. And we have this silo thinking. Developers are allowed to build these stormwater ponds. They build them at the least possible cost to themselves. They don't pay for ongoing operation. The municipalities often don't have the money to operate them on an ongoing way, and so they don't keep them very clean, and so they fill up with crud. And after all, the maintenance department is only given so much money, so they do what they can with the money that they have. And the surface water quality is somebody else's problem, and probably if there's a flood as a result, it's in another municipality downstream. So it's not their problem. And the fundamental problem is it's not funded properly. So almost all municipalities in Ontario, so first of all, almost all stormwater management is funded by the municipalities. Municipalities, almost all of them, fund it either through property tax or through water rates. Both of these are unfair and they are ineffective. So for those who fund them through water rates, it means if you have a laundry, you use a lot of water. But they tend to have a fairly small footprint. How much stormwater are they generating on a laundry site? Not much. But they're paying a fortune for stormwater management. Then you go to the enormous parking lot next door. They don't use any water on the site, so what do they pay for stormwater management? Zero. How much of a problem do they create? Do they have any financial incentive whatsoever to clean up their act, to keep their water on site, to keep it clean even? Nothing. Their incentive is to get the water off their site as fast as possible because someone else is going to pay for it. It's just as bad with property tax, which is where most of it do it, because property tax revenue is always under intense competition. So just imagine that you are the stormwater manager for the municipality of Upper Rubber Boot, and you are going to council asking for money so that you can improve your stormwater management. And the other people who are asking for money are asking for things that are going to be much more popular. The libraries, the playgrounds, the police, the fire department, anything else that a councillor, how many people when they go door to door, knocking on doors, get reelected councillor, are going to be asked about the stormwater management system? But they might get asked about the local pool or the library or any number of things that are a better use of the money. And so the result is the stormwater folks always lose, almost always lose, which is how you end up with a $6.8 billion deficit. And there is a lot at stake. I mean, phosphorus is a piece I'm talking about today, but of course it's not just phosphorus. We have more and more flooding. So how can we pay for what we need? And how can we reduce the costs? Again, we know how. We know that green infrastructure, living things are really good at absorbing and cleaning water. And we know how to grow them. We know that green infrastructure can dramatically reduce the amount of stormwater that's shunted into the lakes. And we know that if we recover the full cost and then put that cost back on property owners so they have a financial incentive to keep the water on their land, they can. So a number of municipalities are doing it. We put out a special report on this. This is what the UK did after their giant floods, is they recognized they've got to charge people who generate the stormwater for that based on impermeable areas, and when you do it, it works. But politicians say, you're taxing me on the rain, and you get into a political deadlock. Then there's agriculture. This is one of those areas that regulators really have not done their jobs. In Ontario, every time I talk about runoff from agriculture, the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs very proudly tells me about their 36,000 farm plans. And Ontario has handed out, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars to farmers for this $36 million farm plans. And they're so proud of the manual for these farm plans. They have a wonderful manual with all sorts of wonderful things that people are supposed to do. How many times have they checked to see whether anybody used the money for what they said they were going to do? 0. They do not check. How many enforcement actions have they taken for people who took the money and didn't do what they said they were going to do? You know the answer to this one. 0. So the only evidence we have is how well this is working is how much phosphorus is there in the watercourses? And you guys know the answer to that. Is it getting better? No. So one might think that after spending hundreds of millions of dollars on this, someone might conclude that the public policy isn't working very well. I don't think those farm plans have any credibility. Yes, the manual is wonderful. Yes, there's some great stuff happening with Alice and Glassy and so on, but they don't have much money. And we know that the Nutrient Management Act, which was supposed to solve part of this, doesn't. Most of the manure being spread in Ontario isn't even caught by the Act. And then, of course, a lot of the phosphorus isn't coming from manure, it's coming from chemical fertilizer. So we know that the government can do something about this. There are lots of tools the government has to do it. But again, the government gives out enormous amounts of money for farmers. And let's think just for a second about crop insurance. Iowa, corn capital of the U.S., has pioneered giving farmers a discount, a 5% discount on their crop insurance if they plant cover crops. So I immediately sent that to the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Look, there's a precedent, you can do this. We don't do that. We just hand out the money for crop insurance. But even though we know that if the soil is healthier, not only will there be less erosion, less phosphorus into the water, it'll also be more resilient to climate change, more drought resistant, more flood resistant, and they'll have fewer crop failures, which we'll have to pay for. But we don't get that. So we've made a number of recommendations, which so far nothing's happened on. If we're going to give people money for reducing phosphorus, then let's tie the money to verified phosphorus reductions. I mean, wouldn't you do that to your kids? If you were giving them money to make the bed, wouldn't you check to make sure the bed was made? Yes? Hey, same thing. Should we allow spreading of phosphorus-containing materials on frozen ground? We know that most of it washes off. Wetlands, of course, and then let's use good science. I mean, the last government appointed a chief science officer, which is wonderful. But how about using science? Let's have metrics for when we hand out money. Let's have some quantitative measurements and some regular reporting. And we don't do that. Then there's wastewater treatment. Wastewater treatment is, incredibly important. It was the secret 40 years ago. It's still important. We do have one example in Ontario of how many people here have studied algae and Ajax? Must be somebody here. Okay, anyway, so, there's a big problem in Algae and Ajax, and there is a giant sewage treatment plant just upriver that only has secondary treatment and that is resisting putting in tertiary treatment, and the problem keeps getting worse and worse. So this is hard to understand. But on the other hand, we know that the ministry tends to look even at the tertiary ones and trying to get them to spend even more money to reduce phosphorus a little bit more. But at this point, I look at this and I think this doesn't make any sense because we do actually care about what things cost and what the energy footprint is. And if you look at going from tertiary to quaternary treatment, which is what you need to reduce the phosphorus from a major sewage treatment plant by sort of kilos, you're talking about enormous amounts of money, like $100,000 a kilo, when you could do enormously more with stormwater retrofits, improving stormwater ponds in the same municipality, maybe going back into agriculture where they can do the same things much less expensively and also not wasting an enormous amount of fossil fuel on these kinds of improvements. And so what tends to happen is that when the Ministry of Environment gets their attention on phosphorus, they go back to squeezing the sewage treatment plants. Because that's what worked 40 years ago, and besides, they regulate the sewage treatment plants, and they're run by municipalities that the province can put its foot on without a lot of political consequences, and you can't do it on farmers. So we get bad decisions in the face of the data. Oh, yes, and the other thing, I don't know if I can go back. No, I can't go back. Never mind. So we do have an example of Ontario of a really good system, which is a phosphorus trading system in the South Nation Conservation Authority, which I might get back to. Wetlands and woodlands, I don't have a lot to say about this except that we're still losing them. Year after year after year after year after the government has recognized and promised and made all kinds of commitments, we have this massive problem. And part of it is the enormous economic pressure to convert land to agriculture and to subdivisions. A part of it is the rampant illegal dumping, both of soil and of other kinds of things. I mean, I saw just some really horrific photos yesterday of asphalt-coated aggregate being dumped by hundreds of thousands of tons around Ontario in uncontrolled areas, which can, again, release all kinds of polyaromatic hydrocarbons into water. And we still have provincial money being used under the Drainage Act to subsidize and pay for the destruction of wetlands. Now, whenever I say this to the Ministry of Agriculture, they say, well, we don't do it if it's a provincially significant wetland that the Ministry of Natural Resources has already certified. But we've looked at how well the Ministry of Natural Resources are doing at getting around to certifying wetlands, and it's terrible. They basically have almost no staff left in southern Ontario, and so they don't get to things on time, and so they get destroyed. So, and then we use public money to drain them. And then there's the whole question about very short-term political attention, and science takes time. I mean, I don't know if I go to a single meeting anywhere where somebody doesn't talk to me about the need for stable, sustained funding. But honestly, the experimental lakes area, we almost threw away the experimental lakes area. Does this make any kind of sense? They don't understand how precious this is, and people tend to have a short attention span. We've paid for something for 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years. Surely that's enough. And so it's very, very hard with a short-term political cycle to maintain funding and attention over long-term slow problems, which is another one of the reasons why climate change keeps getting put off. And in many ways, the politicization of the civil service makes this harder, because it's the job of the civil service to be the custodians of the resources of Ontario for the long term. And that's very, very hard to do when your political masters insist on something different. So I didn't want to have just regulatory failures. Some good things do happen, so I thought I'd talk just a little bit about soil health. I think I mentioned a few minutes ago just how incredibly important soil health is to all kinds of things I care about. When there's more organic matter in soils, they hold more water, so they survive droughts better. They survive floods better, and they don't erode as much. And when they erode, that's when they carry so much of the nutrients and the pesticides and phosphorus into the watercourses. So you'd think it would be a no-brainer. We've lost about 30% of the soil carbon in agricultural soils in Ontario in the last 30 years, which is amazing. And that is mostly a result of changes in farming practices. We don't have a lot of cattle. We don't have a lot of horses anymore. So a lot of the perennial crops, forage areas have been ripped up and planted to corn and soy. We don't have the same rotations that we used to have. It used to be corn, soy, wheat, and maybe alfalfa. There isn't a market for alfalfa, and you can't make money on wheat, and besides, wheat has diseases, so you get more and more people just doing corn and soy. And we have this huge problem with the tenant farmers, and also the machinery has got bigger. So big machinery wants big square fields. So if you used to have a corner or a dip or something that a smaller machine could go around, well, a big machine just knocks it down. So in the face of that, the Ministry of Agriculture and Food really wasn't paying attention to soil health. And it was two farmers who used the tools under the Environmental Bill of Rights to bring this issue back onto the public agenda with a request for review that our office supported. And we put out a special report in 2016 about soil health, how important it is. And it's something we know how to do. There's all kinds of theories that we're going to take carbon out of the air. You've probably heard about negative emissions. Well, maybe you have or you haven't. But all the integrated assessment models, the climate models about how we're all going to be fine, if you look at them, more and more of them include enormous amounts of negative emissions, which is short for magic, right? Somehow we are going to magically take carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, and it's all going to be fine. Well, most of those methods don't work, or they cost extraordinary amounts of money. The one thing that we do know how to do, which absolutely does work, is putting carbon back in agricultural soil. And we know how to do it. It's cover crops, it's crop rotation, it's always having live roots in the soil. It's not leaving the soil bare. It's not putting stuff on in the winter and let it erode. We know how to do this. So we wrote a special report on it, and I am sort of delighted to say that, all right, it took a lot of years and a lot of work. The Ministry of Agriculture and Food has issued this new strategy to study and conserve and actually measure soil health. So it's a great step forward, but of course, you know, like most things that they do about farmers, it's got no teeth. There's no financial incentives and there's no consequences. So, and will we even still have it once there's a new Minister of Agriculture? I don't know. But this has been 10 years of work to get to this point. It wouldn't have happened without the two farmers who took the initiative, and any two of you in Ontario can bring a request to review, and sometimes things happen. It takes a long time. It takes support of our office. We support what we can, but here's a good example. So where do we go from here? There are, for sure, some catalysts for change. You've probably all heard of at least some of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine. And when there are shocks, sometimes you get changes. And one thing I feel confident about, I'm afraid, is we're going to have shocks. Right? We're going to have more storms, more droughts, more floods, more problems. We're going to have more ecological collapses. We're going to have more crises. So, not that I want to have crises, but we know we're going to have them. So, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? So what can we do with those crises? When you get that moment when the public is interested, do you have the story to tell? Maybe something can happen at that point. One of the key things is an engaged public, for sure, and it is hard to get public attention, but lots of people love their corner of the lakes. So maybe you can build on that. Can you reach out to those people? Can you listen to their point of view? And can you maybe incorporate their language, their point of view? Can you engage people in some way in protecting what they love, maybe for their kids and their grandkids? The Environmental Bill of Rights and the registry, it is a tool for public engagement, and we do get some public engagement. This was another request from a member of the public. The public should know when we pour sewage, and you can see a little bit on this picture. You can see there's brown water and there's white and there's blue water. Right? The blue water is the stuff we normally call water. The brown stuff is combined sewage overflow into the lake after an intense storm. Because even after the hundreds of millions of dollars that Toronto has spent to hold combined sewage so that it can be treated, when you get a very intense storm, it just blows over. And then, does the public know? I mean, I know enough not to take my grandchildren down to the beach the day after a heavy storm. But not everybody does. And so we should let people know. This was a request from Mark Mattson, and it was accepted by the Ministry of Environment. We do now have some better public alerts of this. 145 comments, that's not maybe as many, it's not nearly as many as we get on things like the spring bear hunt, but it's still 145 individual comments. People took the time to write. These comments do matter. On the Conservation Authorities Act review, hundreds of people took the time out of their really busy lives, despite everything else they're trying to do, to make these comments. And you folks probably have really useful comments to make because you actually know stuff. Now, Canadians tend to be a little shy and deferential, and to think, well, if I know something, everybody knows it. And anyway, it's easy to find out, and those people in the government that work on this all the time, they must know it already. This is not necessarily so. And very often, if you know something, and you provide that information in a respectful and courteous and plain language way, it can make a difference. There is an actual human reading those comments. Right? And if you just write in, save the blank, stop the blank, that doesn't persuade anybody, I'm afraid. But useful information really can make a difference. So what does an engaged public need? Well, when you get their attention, which is often a crisis, they do want to hear the story in a way, hopefully, that relates to them, and it's nice to have an infographic. It's very important to be able to talk across silos. you know, most of the really, really useful conversations are with people who don't agree with you and aren't exactly in your field. Those conversations can be quite challenging, but they're where a lot of the emotion occurs. Sitting down with people who disagree with you and trying to understand where you have common ground. And on things like lakes, you're working on things that people love from their own point of view. So maybe you can find some common ground on that. And of course, people want to be involved. So using the strengths of science, you guys all know this. You know how important curiosity is. You know how important it is to both look at root causes in the big picture and being persistent year after year and decade after decade, no matter how hard it is. You do have to just keep at it. And it's incredibly important to tell your story and to share your passion the way Helen did today. I mean, that moved all of us. Right? We think sometimes scientists and lawyers that we ought to be dispassionate and we should just the facts, ma'am. People don't make decisions based just on facts. Facts are important, but it's not enough. You've got to touch people, show them a way forward, and persuade them why it matters. So, staying curious, there's all these observations. You all know the stories about how that's weird leads to something important later. Root causes, of course. The big picture, understanding how things link together is tremendously helpful, especially when you go to talk to folks. They're dealing with more issues than you are, probably. So do you have an understanding of the kinds of issues they're dealing with? And yes, persistence. And then finding allies, finding other people that you can talk to. And one of the things that I always encourage scientists is, now, you know, I'm a mother of a scientist, and I know that she's much more comfortable in many ways talking to other scientists. There's a common language, there's a common culture of how to talk to each other. She doesn't have to, you know, put on a psychic raincoat and really go into dangerous territory. It's much easier to talk to other scientists, especially other scientists who are either in her field or that she likes. But that's not where the changes happen. You need to somehow also find ways to communicate to the public and to policymakers, and those are very different audiences. And nobody can do all of this yourselves. You're going to need each other, find other people, but there's lots of, well, not lots, but there's quite a number of people in positions like mine who are trying to be the translators, the bridges. We need information from folks like you. I have the great privilege of access to people who make decisions. What can I offer them that is valuable to them? Well, it's not my opinion. They are not interested in my opinion. But what they can be interested in is, can I bring them facts? Can I bring them understandings? Can I bring them solutions that they don't know? Or can I help them understand the solutions? So, you know, are they real problems? And are these reasonable solutions? Those are the kinds of things I can bring to them, but it's got to be based on stuff that works, because otherwise I blow my credibility out of the water and then I'm no good to anybody. So always, always, always answer, so what? And this has been my biggest problem with scientists and engineers my whole career. I had one case where, you know, it was a very important case, and I worked really hard getting a consultant and do their report and get it done on time and all that sort of stuff. And then when I finally got it, it came to the conclusion that the groundwater was moving at 10 to the minus 3. So, it's moving at 10 to the minus 3. Okay, this meant a great deal to him. It meant nothing to anybody else. Now, admittedly, when I was a young lawyer, I didn't know that judges didn't know that PB meant lead, but you know, you've got to be able to explain why these things matter in simple kinds of terms that people can relate to. And it's a skill, but it's a learned skill, and you guys can all do it. So, and if you want, come this afternoon. Rachel and I are going to be talking more about how to talk to science, the policy will listen, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dianne. It was a really engaging talk, and we've probably got time for a few minutes of questions before we walk over to the Pan Am Centre. So anyone want to do the first?
The Lake Simcoe Protection Act is, you know, a lake-specific legislation.
Maybe stand up so people can hear.
Sorry. The Lake Simcoe Protection Act, an act we have here in Ontario, is aimed at restricting restoring the health of Lake Simcoe, and it's, I believe, one of the only sort of lake-specific legislations that we have. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on whether that type of approach would work elsewhere, or whether it's working even.
Well, we haven't, so the question was, what's my opinion about the Lake Simcoe Protection Act, which is a specific act for a watershed around Lake Simcoe, which is entirely surrounded by cottages and a very large number of septic tanks, many of which have leaked. So the Lake Simcoe Protection Act, so I should say we haven't studied that while I've been commissioner, so I don't have the stats on that. But the question, how do we get watershed-based decision-making? Because municipal boundaries don't coincide with watersheds. And so we have an enormous problem of, you know, if Caledon makes a decision, they're not the ones who flood. So there have been a number of different attempts to try to get this watershed-based decision-making. Conservation authorities are for that. Some of the proposals, or some of the requirements now in the Planning Act for sub-watershed plans and watershed plans are intended to try to force that kind of cooperation. From the limited amount I've heard, it's not going very far. But there's also a lot that can be done with goodwill. So I look at some places like Severn Sound. Severn Sound, I think it's 7 or 8 small municipalities are getting together on a regular basis, both municipal staff, conservation authority staff, and NGOs to talk about the health of the watershed and how they can protect it. So they're able to do a lot without having to be forced to do it. Some places have to be forced, some places do it willingly. Parry Sound is also a place where there seem to be some fairly good cooperation going on. And I would certainly start there. It's hard to sustain the voluntary things, but if you can do it without forcing people, you know, you're not facing so much resentment. A lot of people really hate being ordered what to do. So it can work if there's nothing else, but is there something else?
One more question, perhaps? So you've outlined as consistent with your responsibilities, some of the problems that we face here in the province, and some solutions. It's great for the province of Ontario, but with respect to the Great Lakes as a whole, I've heard estimates that there are north of 1,000 different policies across all the various jurisdictions, provincial, federal, municipal, particularly for the Great Lakes. And there's this notion of, even if we could convince the government that we should do this and they should invest the money and get the policy straight, it may or may not make a lot of difference with respect to the Great Lakes. And I guess my question is, how do we go about coordinating to make policies exist where they don't, to make them consistent across jurisdictions? This is a huge problem. It's not necessarily your problem, but it collectively is our problem. How do you deal with all these conflicting and inconsistent policies?
Well, it is a huge, the question was, what about the conflicting, inconsistent policies in different places around the Great Lakes? The Great Lakes are affected by many levels of government, many different organizations, and you hear how hard it is even within Ontario, imagine across all the jurisdictions. You know, in a way, that's what the International Joint Commission was for. You know, it was the equivalent of the attempt of the Lake Simcoe Protection Act is, we do all live in this same watershed. We share the same water. If you pollute it from one side, the other side gets it too. So we do need to work together, and the IJC is one way to do it. There is no easy answer to that. A lot of it is attention and goodwill. There are you know, for municipalities, many of them would like to do better, and so making it easier for them with perhaps sharing information, sharing model codes, getting people together to talk about it, or, you know, you can do a lot with a webinar, but you don't get the same thing you do when people sit together, and especially if they sit together and eat together and talk about things. So we have the advantage now, we have the most highly educated population we've ever had. We've got the best communication tools we've ever had. We've got, in many ways, the best monitoring tools we've ever had. So these are real advantages that people didn't have before. If Scientists can help make the consequences more visible. That will help, I think, because one of the challenges with the Great Lakes is they're really big. It's kind of like pouring filth into the atmosphere. It's really big. It'll go away. It's not, we don't have the consequences. Whereas if, in a way, the nearshore shunt is almost makes that easier because you can have local impacts from something that otherwise might have gone just out into the general lake. But the main thing, I think, is just keep talking about it and trying to bring people together to common solutions to a common problem, but there's no magic, and it won't be fast. Yes, sir.
The Nutrient Management Act has been around for 20 years, and if it can be enforced, there's enough legislation in there where we could make a massive impact. So it has to be, we have to have the will to instate those enforcement regs regardless of what government is in office at the time. That's the secret. It's there. We just have to enforce it.
Right. Well, the Nutrient Management Act, again, is mostly about animal manures. It's not about chemical fertilizer. And the Nutrient Management Act has done a lot. For the farms it affects, it really has done a lot. When I was in practice, I worked with some of those farmers, and a lot of farmers spend a lot of money improving the way they handle their manure. And so that, there have been some improvements for sure on that. What I haven't seen any improvements on is chemical fertilizer. We're seeing some improvements on that with precision agriculture. We're seeing some improvements on that with programs like Glassy and Alice, where farmers volunteer to become involved, and then that's a question of, is there public money for that? Because those programs are oversubscribed all the time. There isn't enough money for that. But you're a brave man if you think you're going to get politicians to rigorously enforce an environmental law against farmers. If you can do that, tell me how. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you will go to our website and